It all started on a Sunday, when Jemmy, an Angolan man held in bondage near the banks of the Stono River, slipped from his shack and moved toward the morning light with a handful of other men and a single terrible hope: freedom. September 9th, 1739. The port of Charleston hummed with rice, rum, and rumor. Britain and Spain teetered toward war. Spanish Florida dangled a dangerous promise: freedom, land, and arms to any enslaved person who could reach St. Augustine and swear allegiance to the crown. For men and women whose lives were measured by whips and hireling masters, that promise was a map and a spark. Jemmy and a small party struck the Hammond store first, seizing guns and powder. They cut down slaveholders and overseers, gathered more followers as they marched south, and burned a plantation house or two along the way. The rebels moved with military intent: drums, weapons, a crude chain of command, declaring their aim to reach the Spanish haven. When planters heard the drums, panic rippled like wildfire. The colonial response was immediate and ruthless. A militia intercepted the march. The encounter was not a neat battlefield. It was a hunting, a rout, and then a purge. Contemporary accounts written by terrified colonists and later by the men who built South Carolina law record the slaughter: roughly 20 to 25 white colonists killed, and somewhere between 35 and 50 of the rebels massacred in return. Bodies were not simply buried. Heads were severed and fixed on poles along the road to Charleston, intended as a public sermon against insurrection. That display is the image that refused to fade: severed heads as bulletin boards, warning the living of what happened when the enslaved moved toward liberty. But the horror did not end with the corpses. Out of the charred farms and the blood-soaked road came a legislature with a new plan. They called it safety. Planters called it order. Historians call it the Negro Act of 1740, a bundle of statutes that tightened the chains around the enslaved and expanded the power of white masters. It forbade assembly, restricted movement, outlawed literacy for slaves, limited manumission, and made the killing or punishment of an unruly slave a private matter, rather than a criminal lapse punishable by the owner's peers. The law was not just reaction, it was a conspiracy in plain sight, an alliance of wealthy planters, militiamen, and colonial officials who converted panic into permanent legal architecture. Propaganda soothed the conscience and stiffened the resolve. Pamphlets and sermons blamed foreign Catholics, Jesuit priests, and Spanish agitators for turning men to revolt. The narrative erased the daily cruelties of plantation life: long hours in the tide fields, broken families sold at auctions, the constant threat of brutal punishment, and replaced them with a story of outside instigation. That story made repression into defense and collective terror into governance. The Stono Rebellion was brief and contained, but its aftershocks rewired the colony. Where there had been negotiation in custom and occasional manumission, the new laws built surveillance and deterrence into routine. Patrols increased. Curfews hardened into codes. The very memory of the men who marched, Jemmy, whose name slips in and out of record books as Jemmy, Cato, or simply the Angolan leader, was transformed into a cautionary ghost used to justify a tighter yoke. Today, the Stono River runs quiet through the marshes, but the legacy remains. The severed heads and the burning houses are gone. But the legal architecture forged in 1740 became part of a system that codified terror. The conspiracy was not whispered in a single room. It was passed in the halls of power and hammered into law. A deliberate public decision to respond to the terror of rebellion with a permanent program of repression. This is the true life horror from colonial America. Not only the night of blades and blood, but the daylight conspiracy that turned fear into statutes and statutes into a long official silence.